The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, my name is Helen Dion. I am Marketing Manager for SWK Technologies. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Payroll Year-End and 1099 Processing Procedures in Sage 100, presented by Ryan from our Sage 100 Help Desk. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute to keep the background noise down. However, you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. To submit a question, look for the question section in your GoToWebinar pod. We will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording and it will be distributed to all attendees as well as those who were not able to make it today. You will receive an email with the recording tomorrow. Please take a moment at the end of the presentation to answer our short 2-question survey. With that said, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day today to attend our webinar. We're here to help you get the most out of your software solutions and help you find an easier way to run your business by providing you software and industry knowledge, tools, and support you need whenever you need a little help with your Sage 100 software. Lastly, as a quick reminder, SWK is constantly sharing important updates and software tips and tricks on our social media channels, so we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, thank you everybody for coming out today. We're going to go ahead and start off today by going through how to process your 1099s and your W-2s. We're going to go through the 1099 processing first. That way, if any of you only process 1099s, maybe you don't do your own payroll in-house, you won't have to stay for that portion of the presentation. So we will do some questions after the AP portion for any questions that are specific to that. But the first thing we want to look at is how to copy your company. Because at year end is the perfect time for making a copy of your company and reviewing how to do that. A lot of people like to have a copy of their company at year end just as a snapshot of where their company was so that they can always look back at that point and see exactly the way it was right at year end. So you do that by going into Sage, into the Library Master module, and then into Company Maintenance, which is in the main folder in Library Master. In the Company Maintenance window, if you're making a copy and it's for an existing company, basically you're going to overwrite a previous test company or a previous backup, something like that, you would select or enter that company code here. In our situation today, I'm going to make a new backup company, and I'm going to name it B19. I'm just going to type in the name. And then you could also go through and enter in any address information, anything like that that you want. A lot of the forms in Sage use the address that's stored here in Company Maintenance. So if you tried printing any of those forms from the backup company, you would need to have the address here to have the correct address printing on any of those forms. So the next step after putting in the company code and the name is to click the copy button. You'll get a prompt here on the screen warning you that you need to, you'll be picking what modules that you're going to copy, and that if you copy individual modules and not the entire company, that you may end up causing corruption with the company. Like example, if you didn't copy the inventory module, but you did copy sales order and purchase order, you're likely to receive errors or have inconsistent data in those companies or in those modules. So we'll tell that okay. We also get a prompt saying that the company record must be saved, so we'll tell that yes. And this is the next screen that we come to. This is where we tell it what company we want to copy from. In our situation here, we're going to be copying from Y19. And this is a very important step if you are going to be making your own copies to make sure that you're copying in the correct direction Like if you're wanting to come in here and make a test company, occasionally we have a client that ends up copying in the wrong direction, and they copy their test company over the top of their live company. And when that situation happens, there's really no way to undo that other than restoring that company from a backup. So it's important here to make sure you have the correct source company and destination company. In here, you could select individual modules if you want. Today, we want a full backup, so we're going to leave all of them selected, and then we tell it to proceed. Gives you one last chance to make sure that you really want to copy. So that's a good opportunity to check the companies again, and then tell it yes. Now, the amount of time that it takes to copy your company definitely depends on the size of your company. Here with our demo data, it takes under a minute to copy the company. I have some clients with really large data sets, and it can take an hour or more to copy their companies. So just keep that in mind when you're going to go to copy your company. So now we have our B19 company. So we have that as a backup and a snapshot that we would confer back to anytime. Just going to accept that and close it. So the first part that we're going to look at is processing the 1099. And the first thing I want to go over is how to actually mark a vendor as being a 1099 vendor, because that's an important step. So if we look in vendor maintenance in the accounts payable module, which is in the main folder, I'm going to select one of my 1099 vendors. If you come to the second tab, the additional tab, and you look over here, you have all of the fields related to the 1099 form. So this is where you come to mark what type of vendor they are, so an individual or a business, what their default 1099 form is, put in their Social Security or their tax ID number, and set their default box number. Now, all of these default information that you're setting here, that information is going to default when you create an invoice for this vendor. So any invoices that then default and have it marked that it's a miscellaneous form and box 1 or box 7, those amounts, when you pay those invoices, will automatically be recorded, and those are the dollar amounts that get used on your 1099 forms at the end of the year. So it's important to set this up as soon as you can. To actually print our 1099s, we come into the Reports folder in Accounts Payable, and we select Form 1099 Tax Reporting. So the 1099 forms and the W-2 forms, they are printed in Sage using a partnership that Sage has made with a third-party company named Atrix. So they use an Atrix or an e-filing software that they have developed. So that has to be installed on any workstations that are going to print the 1099s or W-2s. So if you go to launch this and you may see a message pop up telling you that you need to have the e-filing installed on your workstation. And you can tell that prompt yes, that you want to install it now, and it'll go through and attempt to install it. I've seen some clients, depending on their security setups, where they may have problems getting that to install. In those situations, you need to work with your IT and probably have your IT log in as an administrator, and then come out to your Mass 90 folder on the server, into the WK Setup folder, right-click on the autorun.exe, and tell it to run as administrator. And then from here, you can tell it to install federal and state tax reporting. Once that installation pops up, you don't really have to pick any options. You just have to click OK through some of their terms and conditions and tell it next a few times, but that will install it on your workstation. So here on the 1099 form, The first thing we have to do is the form to use. We're going to tell it new because we're printing the 1099s for the first time this year. Then we tell it what form type we want. So we're going to pick miscellaneous. We can pick what vendor types we want in case you are wanting to separate your individuals and your businesses, but we're going to leave it at all types. You pick your 1099 calendar year. And then over here in this minimum year to date, this is where you can set the minimum year to date amount to actually select the vendor and include them for 1099 printing. And for today, I'm going to leave it at, them all at 0 so that we get everybody. Here you have your company information. This is the info that's going to print on the 1099 form for your company. So if there's any adjustments that you need to make, you can make those here. And then lastly, we come down and we tell it accept. So when you tell it accept, it goes out and it connects to Atrix servers and checks to see if there are any changes or updates for any forms. And it actually checks not just for 1099s, but it checks for payroll tax forms. And it also checks all of the states. So if any state has come out with an update to one of their tax forms, you're going to get a prompt telling you that you need to update. That prompt looks like this, just a little pop-up. You'll want to tell it to do the automatic update. And I have a few clients that have issues running this where the automatic update doesn't work. In that situation, you'd need to have your IT help you and log on to your workstation as a domain administrator, and then log into Sage and run this, and then you'll be able to do the automatic update. Once the automatic update is done, you can log back in with your user, and you'll be able to move forward and move through the processing of the forms. So once we get in here, it takes us through a wizard process. So it asks you several questions about your company. The first question here is whether you'd like to start processing your 1099s or if you'd like to go through a test drive. So if you'd like, after the webinar, you can go back to your company and you can run through a test where you can kind of get the feel for how it is to process your 1099s without it actually printing anything or sending anything off to Atrix. But for today, we're going to tell it no thanks, so we want to start processing our 1099s. I'll tell that next. The next screen here just confirms your tax ID number for your company. I'll tell that next. Now it's asking if you have multiple companies that have the same tax ID number. So if you had multiple companies in Sage that were all really one company as far as the government is concerned, you could tell it that you're using multiple 1099 data files. For us today, we're going to tell it no. Next screen here is reviewing your payer information again. So if there's any changes you would like to make, if you want to enter in your information in the contact area, you can do that. That way you'll receive any correspondence from the government. So we fill that out and then we tell it next. Next it's asking you what type of tax preparer you are, whether you are filing for your own company or employer, or whether you're a third-party tax preparer. So we're going to leave it as I'm filing for my own company. This screen, if there were any state tax codes that were needed for the filing, it would show those here and you could verify and make sure that the numbers are correct. Otherwise, right now, we'll go ahead and just tell it next. Next question is asking if we have any recipients who elected to receive electronic forms for their 1099s. We're going to tell that no. And here it's asking us about the receipt identification numbers. So if you would like, and you don't want the full Social Security numbers or tax ID numbers printing on forms, you can tell them to truncate them or print X's. For today, I'm just going to tell it no truncation and let it print the full number. So that's the end of the wizard questions. So at this point, it gathers all the data that you have for your 1099 vendors, and it gathers the answers to those questions. And then it's going to open another window that presents all of that information in a grid. And then we'll walk through several steps of verifying and testing that data in the grid. So you may see this message pop up in yours. It's basically telling you that address line 1 cannot be blank. Do you want to copy the data that's in address line 2 into address line 1? Because it's a common mistake that maybe you just typed the address into the wrong field. For our purposes today, I'm going to tell it no, because I intentionally made that mistake in one of my vendors so that I can show correcting it. Okay, so this is the 1099 preparer window. So in this grid, it has two sections. Over here on the left is the address and generic info about each of the vendors. And over here on the right is the dollar amounts that you might see. And we have a bar in the middle that we can drag either left or right to see more of either section. So these first few steps, we are going to be verifying data about the vendor or the company's addresses and that type of information. So I'm going to drag that a little further to the right so we can see more of those fields. So in this screen, up here at the top, we have a next button. So you can look over the information. The first step is to verify the recipient taxpayer identification number. So it highlights the columns that it's wanting you to review in blue. So you can look through and check those and make sure everything's correct. Once you're sure that everything's good, then you can tell it next. And up here, it'll tell us that it's moving on to another step. So now it's wanting us to verify the federal ID number. We'll tell that next. Now it's wanting us to look at the recipient's name and addresses. So basically, you just keep moving next through each of these questions, and whatever information it's wanting you to look at that's highlighted in blue, you'll want to look that over, make sure everything seems correct. So if we tell that next, so we get this error. So basically, we have some data that didn't pass their validation. So we're going to get that information here. So it's telling us that address line 1 cannot be blank, and it highlights that row and that individual cell in red so that we can fix it. Now, if you are processing a large number of 1099s, you may end up in a situation where you have a very large number of errors that you have to work through. In that situation, you do have the option to tell it to print a list. And in that situation, then you can review all of them on that list and correct them, and it may be easier for you. But for here, I'm going to tell it to go back and correct. I can see that the address accidentally got put in address line 2, so I'm just going to move that over into address line 1, and then I tell it next. Now, making that correction here in this grid does not make any changes to your data in Sage or your vendor file. So any corrections or changes you make here don't affect Sage. So if it's something like this, where it's just a problem with their address, it's usually a good idea to also go into that vendor's record and make those same changes there. That way you don't end up with this same error every single year when you process 1099s for them. So the next step here is to verify all of the income boxes. So we can see here we have some money here for the vendors in box 1 and some over here in box 7. So the best way to verify the dollar amounts on your 1099s is to run the payment history report, and that's in the reports folder in accounts payable. So with this report, it has an option down here where we can tell it that we want to print only 1099 vendors. So we can check that. And then here we can specify the date range that we want to print for. So we can tell it all of 2019. That way we can see all the checks that we paid to any vendor that's marked as a 1099 vendor. Because remember, having the dollar amounts flow through into the 1099 buckets for the vendor really depends on whether that invoice was marked as being a 1099 invoice, because you may have some vendors that all of the payments you're making to them don't really apply to being a 1099. And I also want to change one other thing in there. So we'll mark it for 1099 all year, and we'll tell it to sort by vendor number. That way you can get a subtotal for each vendor. So here we can see the total payment amounts for each of the vendors, and we can also open up our grid here and we can compare. So we can see here for our first vendor that it is saying that for 01 Anders, we only have $1,250. But if we look in here, we've paid them $1,500. So that means at some point there was an invoice that didn't get marked as being a 1099 invoice. Maybe it was when the vendor was first set up and they weren't marked as a 1099 vendor. That's usually the most common cause. So if we want to correct that, we can just click on any of these cells here, and I can manually change the amount to $1,500. Now, if you want to make that same change in Sage so that in case you have to start over or you want to just refer back and have the correct information in Sage, we come back and go into vendor maintenance. We select the vendor that we want, come to tab 2, the additional tab, and then we can click this 1099 history button. This will open up this screen here where we can select the form type and the calendar year, and then we can just enter any of the dollar amounts. So if you did have a vendor that didn't get marked as a 1099 vendor until maybe you'd been doing business with them for a little while, when you realize that, you can go and figure out at that point how much money you've paid them that should have gone to a 1099, and you can come in here and correct that right away. That way it's already correct when you go to process your 1099s at the end of the year. So I'm going to change that to $1,500 and then tell it OK. So now it will be correct if we restart any of our 1099 processing. So we've verified the dollar amounts here. So we can tell that next again. Then it's asking to verify the states. Tell that next. Verify the state income. Okay, so now that we've made it through all of the data validation in that grid, we're going to come to this window here where we actually can print or electronically submit the forms. So the first thing you're going to get is an ad from Atrix. That's the company that Sage is partnering with. I think this ad is still related to last year's because we're doing this a little early. That's where we get these messages about missing our January 31st postmark. But last year, at least, it was $229 per recipient to have Atrix e-file everything for you. So for that amount, they would actually electronically file with the government for you, and they would print and mail out the 1099s to all of the vendors for you. So it's really a pretty good option. It really doesn't cost you much more than actually buying all the forms for yourself and spending all of that time printing and stuffing envelopes. So more and more, I like to recommend that option to people. Saves you a lot of headaches. So we'll just tell it next on this first screen. On this screen, you get to choose. So like I said, if you want to do the complete e-file option, you can select that. It shows you the number of recipients and what the price per recipient is. And there is a $25 minimum. If you don't want to do that, you can come to these other options here. You can choose to mix and match. So you can tell it you want to print your recipients' copies, but still have them e-file for you. Or you can take those off, and then you can print the federal and state copies yourself. So if you go that route, you don't have to pay anything to Atrix, but you do still have to have the correct forms for printing onto. And these are not the forms that you would go down to your local office supply store and purchase. It's not those forms. You would actually need to come to Sage's website, and that's sagechecks.com. On here, they have a section for tax forms. You would select the 1099s and 1096. Then it's going to ask you what software, what Sage software you're using. So we would choose Sage 100. Then it would ask for the version of Sage. So we are 2016 or later. Then we would tell that continue. In here, you can see all the different forms that are available and the different bundles. So they have some that are simple and just include your federal copy, the one with red ink, or they have some complete bundles that have the red copy and also has the blank forms. I'll show you that when that comes up. Okay, that didn't want to open. But you can see here in this one, the other forms, they are a 4-part per page form. They are blank on the front and they are perforated. That's what the lines are. They do have a few registration marks on them to make sure that they line up and they can be scanned by the government. But yeah, so they have bundles that have both of those or some that are just the red copies. So you'll have to look at what your needs are, and depending on what options you choose, pick the correct forms and order those. So a lot of times, unless you're going to be printing a very large number of them at these lower price, if you're going to, it's as much as $2.36 for each of them. So at that price, it's cheaper to actually just pay Atrix to submit them for you. So keep that in mind. So back here on this screen, I want to demo the complete e-file option. So we're going to select that. On the next screen here, you have an option to get a PDF archive of your 1099s. So for $35 plus $5 shipping and handling, they will save all of your 1099 forms in PDF format, save it onto a CD, and mail it to you. That way you have that hard copy still that you can refer back to in case your server completely crashes or something else happens. You still have this backup if you're needing to get back and reprint any of the 1099 forms. Right now, I'm going to tell it no thank you, though. Here it shows us what states that we had paid people for and lets us pick which ones that we're going to file for. We'll leave that checked and tell it next. And then here, it shows us all of the selections that we've made. So it shows us that we're going to be e-filing the federal and state copies, and then we have the recipients that are going to get copies. So we'll tell that next. So this next window that comes up is going to show you what the forms look like so that you can scroll through the pages and verify that everything looks correct. At the very top of the screen, it shows us this is report 1 of 5, and it's our California 1099 MISC. So you can come through here, and if there were multiple pages, we only have 3 people. If there were multiple pages, you could use the arrow to cycle through those and review them. If you wanted to print these, you can come up here and tell it to print the copy. In here, you can set your printer, and this is also where you can set the alignment of the forms. So if you're printing official copies that are going to be sent to the government, they have requirements about exactly how they line up on the page. So you can print an alignment form from your printer. It'll look like this. Basically, it prints out and shows you all the lines around the margins of the page, and then also circles in the corners. Each of these lines should be exactly 1 inch from the edge of the paper. So since every printer pulls paper slightly differently, you'll need to print this and then get a ruler and measure to figure out if it's correct. If it's not correct, you can come in here and click the page align. And in here, you can use these arrows to move the form to the left or right. Or if you know exactly how far you want to move it in inches and decimal, you can specify that as well. But basically, you'll want to come in here and adjust that, and then print the alignment form again and print a test page to make sure that you have everything lined up correctly so that none of your forms get sent back. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just tell this to print. So once you're done printing your form, so this is what it looks like. Looks like the 1099, but since this is not the official copy because we chose to have it e-filed, it tells us that it's a record copy. Once you have that form done, up here with the green arrow, you can tell it next. And then it takes you to the next form. And we can see the next form is going to be the California 1096 form. And then it's the same process where we would tell that to print a copy, and then we'd move on to the next. So I'm going to just tell it next and cancel through printing those forms. Next is the payer 1099 mix. Then we have the federal 1099. And finally, the federal 1096. So once that is done, then it goes and starts connecting out to Atrix. So on this screen, you would go through and put in your username and password. Now this is a login that is you specifically create with Atrix. But if you have done this in a prior year, it does use the same login for each year. If it's your first time doing it, you can come out here and tell it that you've forgotten your login. And then you can go out and create a login. So I'm going to close out at that point. So it's warning me that the filing has not been complete. Am I sure I want to cancel the session? I'm going to tell it yes. And then because we're canceling out before we finished, it wants to know why. I'm just telling it that we're testing the process. And it takes us back to the grid here. The other thing to point out in the grid section here is if you're a very large employer or a large company that maybe has a lot of 1099 vendors that you work with, you may not be able to do this all in one sitting. It may be something that you have to work on over a couple days. So you don't want to lose any of that work that you may have done or started with. So from this screen, you can come up and tell it File and Save. And it will save all of the information that you have set here in this grid so that you can come back to it at a later date. So after we save, then we exit. And then it asks us at the end here, every time you're done printing 1099s or done with those windows, it asks you if you want to increment your default 1099 calendar year. And I'm just going to tell that no, because I'm not done with 2019 and I want to keep working on it. So if I wanted to do those again or start back up with that work, in here for the form to use, instead of picking new, I would choose history, still choose my miscellaneous and my year. But when I click accept on the bottom, instead of walking me through that wizard process, it's going to open up this screen here and show me any previous times that I may have been printing 1099s. And I can select any of those, and I could remove them if they're really old and I don't want them anymore, or I can tell it to edit, and then it'll take me back into the grid where I can continue working on preparing my 1099s. So that is everything we have for showing 1099 processing. Why don't we open it up for questions? So go ahead and type in any questions if there's anything that you're not sure about, or if you want to see in any more detail, we can take a look at that.
Ryan, we have a few questions that have come in.
Okay.
This is from the beginning of the presentation. Is the source company the same as the live company?
Yes, the source company is the company that you're copying from. So yes, if you're making a backup of your live company, you would be picking your live company.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have if I go into the vendor maintenance to change the 1099 info for each vendor, will it accumulate the totals going backwards? Or will it only start accumulating the totals going forward from that moment?
It will only be going forward because like I said, in those values that you enter into the vendor are basically just the defaults that will be assigned when you start to create a new invoice for that vendor. So it will only affect new invoices that are created. You'll have to manually go back and put in the dollar amount for any invoices or payments that you may have made prior.
Got it. We also have, can you please walk us through what the vendor will receive if the electronic method was chosen? For example, what email address is used when sending the E1099 to the vendor? Does the vendor follow a link to get to the 1099 or is there a password?
I haven't personally tried that option before, so I don't know what it will look like for the vendor's receipt. I believe that they will get a link to log on to an Atrix website where they will be able to print their own copy of the forms, but I don't know for sure because I've never been on the receiving end of that.
Okay. That is all we have at this time.
Okay. So next we will move on to payroll. So payroll, the process for printing the W-2s is pretty similar. It is done from the period end menu. And you would select federal and state tax reporting. And depending on what version of Sage that you're on, some of the older versions actually show federal e-filing and they have a separate option for state e-filing. If that's the case, you'd want to select the federal e-filing. So in here, you would pick what type of form that you want to look at, federal, state, or existing reports. Those are basically the saved work that you may have started previously. So we'll select federal, and then we'll use the magnifying glass down here to pick what form. And down at the bottom, if I scroll down, I have 2019 W2/W3. So I'll select that. And then from here, I can specify what year I'm reporting on. I can specify my company information. And if I was only needing to print W-2s for a specific subset of employees, I could also specify that employee range here. Go ahead and tell that to proceed. So here it's giving me a warning, basically showing me that I had a different status for some of my California tax setups previously than what I have right now. So it's just making sure that I really want to make that change. So I'm just going to tell that okay. Okay, so it walks us through a wizard process just like the 1099s did. Again, the first question is asking if we want to start our W-2s or if we want to do a test drive. So we're going to tell it no thanks, that we want to start processing. It lets us verify what our company tax ID number is. And then here it's asking us if we have multiple companies using this one tax ID number or if it's just this one. So we're going to tell it no, that it's just a single payroll. Here on the company information screen, you can check over your company info, make sure everything's correct. You can add in your contact information if you want. Put any phone numbers or emails, and then we can tell it next. We can tell it what type of tax preparer we are. We can tell it that we're filing for our own company or if we're third party. And then here it shows us all of our state tax account numbers. So we can verify any of those. If any of them were incorrect, we could select them and tell it that we wanted to edit them. Under the data verification, it just asks us a few questions. Do we have any employees that are exempt from any part of Medicare or Social Security? Do we have any employees who are members of the clergy? Do we want to use control members on W-2s, numbers? And do we have any employees who elected to receive electronic forms for W-2s? So we're going to leave all of those at no, and we'll tell it next. Here for the W-3, we need to tell it what kind of payer we are. So we're going to tell it 941, and then we can tell it next. So that takes us through all of the questions in the wizard section. So it's going to gather that information now and present us with a grid again. Like the 1099 form, it has seen that we have at least one employee who's missing in address line 1, and it's asking us if we want to copy address line 2 into address line 1. I'm going to tell it no so that we can use that for our demo in a minute. Okay, so we have a grid just like we had with the 1099s. On the left-hand side here, we can review all the employees' information like their name and address and social security number. And on the right-hand side, we have the dollar amounts that go in the different boxes for the W-2. So we again move through the steps to do the verification. So the first one is to verify the employee info. So it wants you to look through all of the columns over here that are highlighted in blue. Just going to make a few more of those visible. And then you tell it next once you think you have everything correct. If you have any mistakes or things that it doesn't allow, it's going to mark those in red. So this time there's 3 issues that it found. First one being that there's a social security number that starts with 9, and that's not a valid character for the first character in a social security number. We have an employee that has their middle initial in with their first name, so we need to fix that. And then we also have somebody missing address line 1. So we tell it go back and correct. I'm going to move the address over. I'll take their middle initial out, and I'll move it over into the middle name column. And then I will fix the social security number, change that 9 to an 8. So then we can tell it next again. So now it wants us to verify the additional employee info, like whether they're a statutory employee, retirement plan, or if they have third-party sick pay. So So you would look over those fields and tell it next once they're correct. Now it wants us to verify their federal wages. So this is where you would review with your quarterly reports, your 941 reports, make sure all of their wages are correct. If all of that's correct, then we tell it next here. And I want you to check the state information. And then it wants you to verify all their other data, or basically the general fields. So once we've made it through all of the verifying of the data, it takes us back to this screen where we can choose what we want to print. So I'm going to tell it next past these forms. So this time, instead of doing the complete e-filing, I want to take a look at the other options. And I'm going to tell it that I want to print my employees. I'm going to turn off the e-filing options. And I'm going to tell it that I want to print the federal and state copies as well. So we'll tell that next. So if you choose to not do the complete e-file, you'll get this screen, which kind of highlights some of the benefits of the complete e-file option, just trying to sell you on it once more. So we'll click next past that as well. Shows us what states that we'll be filing for. We'll tell that next. And then it reviews all of the forms that we'll be printing. And we can tell that next. So it takes us into this screen here where we can review our employee information and review what the forms are going to look like. We're printing the Wisconsin W-2s, so we can tell it to print final. And then when you're printing official copies, it lets you know what type of paper you should be using. So it tells us to insert the 4-part blank perforated W-2 paper you purchased. So again, that is paper that needs to be purchased from the Sage Checks website. So if we come under tax forms, W-2s and W-3s, we can see the forms that are available. So we tell it OK once we have that paper inserted. Pick our correct printer and tell it to print. And you can see here what the form looks like. And we can tell it next to move on to the next one. The second report is going to be the employee's W-2, so their copy. So we'll tell that to print final, telling us to insert the 4-part blank perforated W-2 paper. We tell that next to move on to the next form. The third form here is going to be the employer's copy of the W-2. print that. Again, 4-part blank perforated W-2 paper. Tell that next. The fourth form is your federal W-2. Tell that print final. It's warning us that it can't be printed on perforated paper and telling us to insert plain paper now. So this form you just print on normal plain printer paper. So we tell that okay. Tell it next. Then we have the federal W-3 form. We print that one. Again, it didn't tell us to insert any special paper, so it's just plain paper. Tell it next. And finally, you have the W-2 notice form. This is basically the instructions for your employers, information on all the different boxes and what should go in them. So you would print a copy of this, again on plain paper. So now that we're done with the last one, we tell it next. And we get this W-2 history information. It gives us a summary showing all the different forms that we're going to print and which ones that we've printed. It gives us the option to either reprint, e-file any incomplete, correct and complete the W-2s. We could start over, or we could do a password lookup. But here we're just going to tell it close because we're done with everything. And that just takes us out of the process and takes us back to Sage 100. Now, the other thing that you'll need to do at the end of the year is to close, do period end processing in payroll. So that can be, again, be done under the period end menu. The first thing you would want to do is come into the period end report selection. In here, you can pick which forms that you want to print. If there's any of these that you don't want, you can just come over here and select it and click the X to remove it. Also, when you're launching the period end processing, you'll have a choice with a checkbox to choose whether you want to print any of these reports at all. So you can just uncheck it there and none of them will print. Personally, what I usually recommend for people is to go through and print these reports ahead of time, because these are just different reports that you find under the reports menu in payroll. That way you'll have much greater control over all the different options that you're running the report with, because if you run it this way, it's just everything's with the default, and maybe that doesn't really match exactly what you need or what you're looking for. But once you have all of the reports that you want, you can come into period end processing. So here's where you can leave that checked, and it would print all of those reports that we had selected. Or if we left it unchecked, then we could tell it to proceed, and it would move forward and actually close the quarter. And I'm not going to do that at this point. So closing the quarter and doing the year end, that's something that you would want to do once you're done with your payroll for that quarter. If you are on an older version of Sage, something prior to Sage 100 2018, then you actually can't close the quarter until you have printed all of your W-2 forms. If you're on that older version, you'll actually be wanting to print your W-2 forms from that year-end backup company. So you would do all of your printing there, and you would actually never close the quarter in that backup company. You would only close the quarter in your current or live company. Another thing we wanted to talk about was the tax tables. So the tax tables will be released a little later this month for the first quarter of 2020. They are going to be available for versions Sage 100 2017 and up. But this will be the last tax table update that will be coming out for Sage 100 2017. So if you are still on that version of Sage, you'll want to make sure you talk to consulting or talk to us, and we can start getting you scheduled for upgrading your Sage so that you can be on a current version that's receiving tax table updates. If you are on an older version of Sage and still using Payroll, you can manually update your tax tables. And you can contact the help desk, and we can help you out with that. And you can do that by emailing helpdesk@swktech.com, because it is a little more of an involved process to manually update those and match them with the information that's on the Circular E form. Another thing, the government is coming out with a new W-4 form. So they don't prompt and ask you for the number of dependents anymore. They're going to be asking you questions about your expected earnings, whether you have earnings from any other jobs or anything like that, to basically determine the amount of taxes to be withheld. Sage is going to be releasing an update this week that will allow Sage to do that, or allow Sage 100 to process that way. But you do have to be on version 2.20 of Payroll. So that's the new style of Payroll. So if you're on Sage 100 2017 or below, you will not receive that update. If you are on the new versions of Payroll, you'll need to make sure that you get your payroll updated before the new year starts. But these W-4 forms, there's not a requirement to have all of your employees fill them out again. It only applies to new employees who are hired after January 1st, and anybody who decides to make a change to their elections on the W-4 form, they would be required to use the new form and the new selections. So all of your existing employees, they will stay the same the way they are in Sage, and they will still calculate everything correctly there. And I believe that is everything that we have to go through today. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions for payroll, or if there's anything else we may have missed you have a question about.
Thanks, Ryan. We have quite a few questions that have come in, so we'll get started. The first one is, I have the 2016 version of Sage 100. Are there any problems we will be encountering in printing 1099s? Sorry if I missed if previously discussed.
No, so 2016 version isn't supported by Sage. But as long as you are still current on your maintenance with Sage, Atrix will still work, and you'll still be able to print your 1099 or W-2 forms through there. So yeah, you'll still be fine.
Great. Do I need to mark yes if an employee who went over the SS max for the year?
I think the question was in the wizard, it asks if you have any employees that are exempt. I don't think that that's the same. I think exempted would be if you had any employees making such a small amount that they don't have to have any taxes taken out. I believe that's what that question was related to.
Okay. This person can clarify further if that wasn't the answer they were looking for. Next we have, can you manually add dollar amounts in the boxes, such as health insurance paid for owners that need to be reported on their W-2s?
Absolutely, yeah. When you are in those grids, you can change any of the values there. But once again, remember, it doesn't change any of your data that you have in Sage. But yeah, if you need to report the healthcare portion that a company is contributing to an employee and maybe you didn't have your system set up for that, you can calculate that dollar amount manually and you can add it in that grid and it'll print correctly on their W-2s.
All right, great. Must we import the information and start the W-2 process before running the first payroll in 2020?
If you are on the newer versions of Sage, the 2.x versions, no, you don't have to, because it keeps multiple years of history. You're telling it and specifying that you are running these W-2s for 2019, so it uses that information from your employees, so you can absolutely start processing your payrolls for the next year. If you are on the older versions, that's where you have to process your W-2s from the backup company that you made and leave that backup company in the 2019 year. And your new company, that's where you would do, or your live company, that's where you would do year-end processing and actually end up closing and processing your payroll in that new company, in the live company.
Okay. How do we add values to box 12A and 14 on the W-2?
So yeah, when you're at that step with the grid screen, you can click on any of those cells and add any information or any dollar amounts there that you want to. So you can go through and edit and adjust any of those amounts.
We have local city tax and they want us to e-file to them. How would this be done?
Sorry, say that again.
We have local city tax and they want us to e-file to them. How would this be done?
So if you need to e-file anything, that's where you have to choose those options to have Atrix e-file. And you would basically be setting up an account with Atrix, and they have a separate support department over there. So you could talk with them if you had questions about a specific city locality like that, something that's a little more specific than, you know, the federal government or a state, and they would be able to go through that with you.
Okay. We prepared W-2s during the first 2 weeks of January. In the past, we had tax table maintenance where I would manually change the tax limits and percentages back to the previous year settings when working with W-2s. Then I would return the settings to the current year when returning to the live company to access payroll.
So that is something that you had to do in the older or the legacy versions of payroll. If you are on Sage 100 2018 or above, you don't have to worry about that anymore. The tax tables are all specific to the year that you're processing from. So when we're running a report and we're telling it that we're reporting off of 2019, it knows to look at the tax rates and all the tax limits that apply to 2019. So you can download the new 2020 tax tables when it prompts you and tells you that there's an update for the tax tables. And then when you start processing payrolls in 2020, it uses the correct tax tables there.
Okay, and the follow-up question to that comment was, my question is, do we still need to manually change the tax limits and percentages when returning to the previous year company? If so, how do we go about this? It sounds like you just answered that, right?
Yeah, you only have to do that if you're on the older versions of Sage.
Okay. Next, we have approximately half of our employees have elected to receive the W-2 electronically. Some question as the e-submissions on the 1099. What will the employee receive, and whose email address would it come from?
They will receive an email. The email will be coming from Atrix, so it will be an Atrix email address, but I don't know exactly the exact email address that it would come from.
Okay. If we have Sage 2018 that has all the previous payroll data, do we still need to copy a company? We had copied a company previously for W-2 printing the following year. Does that still apply in Sage 2018, or can you print W-2s out of the live company in that version?
You can absolutely print the W-2s out of the live version. You don't have to make a backup copy of the company. Some people still like to do it so that they have something to refer back to, but you don't have to use that backup company for processing your W-2s or anything like that. That can all be done in your live company.
Okay. We have Sage 100 2017. How can I handle new employees' W-4s? I was told there was a manual way.
So basically, the manual way is that you would have to, two ways. You have to connect out to federal government and basically manually calculate what their tax amounts are. And then when you're processing their payroll check, you can tell it to do manual taxes and put in the tax rates that you calculated on the government's website. Otherwise, you can do that to figure out what their tax amounts are, and then you can put in a number of withholdings and run some tests, and you may get a tax withholding that is close, but I don't know that you'll get something that exactly matches with what their tax rates should be. If it is a salaried person, you can manually calculate what their taxes are, and then you can go through and set that as the deduction amount for each pay period, and then it'll automatically just deduct that amount. But otherwise, to really calculate it correctly, you would need to upgrade to the latest versions of Sage.
Okay. Can I run W-2s after closing the quarter and year?
Yes, you can. You can go back and run reports through the federal e-filing section for any prior quarters or anything like that.
All right. Can I get the W-4 update for Payroll V2 2019?
So I think the question is if you're on Payroll 2.19, it's not coming out for that. You will have to upgrade to the Payroll 2.20. So they have changed payroll so that it's not, the version of your payroll is not directly tied to your Sage 100. So you can be on Sage 100 2018 and you can upgrade just your payroll portion to version 2.20 so that your payroll is compliant and you would get that update, but your rest of your Sage still stays the same.
Okay. Can you show how to check your version of tax table, or how do you do an update?
So in Sage 100 2018, it automatically checks whenever you go into the payroll module, checks to see if there are any tax table updates, and it automatically prompts you and tells you, hey, there's a new tax table update. Do you want to download it?
This person has Sage 2017.
If you're on Sage 2017, then you can go into the library master module under reports, and you can do your installed modules listing and preview that. And one of the entries here on your installed modules listing is your tax table version. It doesn't show here in the newer versions, but in yours it'll say tax tables and it'll say 2017 Q3 or something, or sorry, 2019 Q3 or something like that.
Okay, can you please share a telephone number for Atrix support?
I don't have that at this point. Let me see.
If you want, Ryan, once you get your hands on it, I can make sure we include it in the follow-up email tomorrow.
Yeah, because I don't have that on hand.
Okay. If on 2018 version 2.19, what do you have to do to update?
So there is an update program that would have to be downloaded and installed on your server. It's something that you would want to usually have assistance with unless you're previously comfortable with upgrading yourself or something like that, but I would usually recommend having us help you with that. So you would be contacting SWK and one of the consultants would connect with you and get that installed.
Okay. And lastly, we have a question that I can answer. Will there be a recording available for us to get this presentation? And the answer is yes. Everyone who has attended, and even those who registered but were not able to attend, will get a recording in about 24 hours. So if anyone else has any questions, feel free to type them into the question section. If not, you can contact our help desk and we'll make sure that you are able to get the answer to your question. We do have one more that's come in. How do you update employer-specific tax rates?
What do you mean by employer-specific tax rates?
Let's see. We'll see if they're able to clarify. In the meantime, we have another question that's come in. In version 2019, how do you see what payroll tax table update you are running?
I'm not certain if there is a way to show that. Let's see this. So under the utilities menu in payroll, there's a payroll tax update report. It shows you the date the update was installed on. And if we preview that report, it shows it when it was installed and what things were changed. It doesn't specifically say like when that tax update was released, but you'd be able to see the last time your tax tables were updated. You can also run the payroll tax update and have it go out and check for tax updates. But yeah.
Okay. So there's a follow-up to the original question, how do you update employer-specific tax rates? The follow-up was such as state unemployment insurance rate, which can change every year. This would also include the ETT rate and SDI rate.
believe that is done here under the Setup folder in Payroll. Under your tax profile. No, not under there, under your company tax group setup. So you can come over to tab 3 for tax rates and specify the tax rates.
Okay, great.
The Atrix support number is 701-746-6814.
Can you repeat that one more time?
701-746-6814. They are open Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Central Time.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. All right, so I think that does it for today's presentation. So thank you so much, Ryan, for taking the time to go through this.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.